All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody who's watching this, and welcome to our CPG and multi-brand digital analytics virtual summit. I am your host with the most. My name is Dom Villarreal. I am the partnerships lead here at InfoTrust. Been here for around 3.5 years, and during that time, I've had the opportunity to speak with many different organizations, and some included in the CPG and the multi-brand space. And we're really excited to have this conversation, really this whole summit, if you will, today with you all to talk about the big trends that we're seeing, a lot of those big keywords and topics that you're hearing through LinkedIn, or you're hearing through conversations at work, or if you're hearing through the DAA or other associations, really getting to the bottom of it. What does this mean for your organization? Now, this summit's a little bit different than what we've typically done in the past. If you've attended one of our summits in the past, you will notice this is only 2 hours. The reason why is we understand that you all have busy schedules and want to be mindful of your time. So today it's going to be pretty more rapid fire sessions where we're going to dive, as deep as we can into these different topics. And if you have any questions during those topics, we have a panel for you guys to answer in the question box below. Feel free to submit those questions. We'll do our best to answer those in the chat, or if we have time during the sessions. But we only have about 20 minutes per session, so we're going to be going through them pretty quickly. If we don't have the time to answer them, we will make sure to follow up with them. But we're really excited to try this new format with you guys. All right. Now, obviously, we could not do this without you all here. And look at this wonderful list of registrants. We're really excited to have you all here from different verticals to really talk about the big key items. So we can't thank you enough for continuing to allow us to come and speak with you all and share a little bit about what we're seeing. And of course, we can't also forget about the wonderful speakers that we have today. So you are going to hear from some of the top minds in the industry right now about some of those key items. And on that note, I think it's time we go ahead and get started. So here's what we're going to be doing. We're going to kick it off with our keynote session. And really what we're going to be talking about are industry trends and insights. And during this session, I have two great colleagues of mine joining from the CPG team here at InfoTrust. We have Tom and Nadal. Tom and Nadal, thank you so much for really kicking off this summit. I'm going to turn it over to you two, and good luck.
Thanks, Tom. Appreciate it. Really happy to be here, chatting with everyone. Thanks again for joining. I know it's not always easy to fit into a busy day, as Dom was saying, but it's important to talk through, and we're looking forward to working through together some of the industry changes happening and where we all go from here and how we can respond to it. My name is Tom Lundeen. I'm industry team lead here for CPG and multi-brand at InfoTrust, and thrilled to be talking to you today, and very honored to be working with my colleague to co-present this presentation. Nadal, can you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Tom. And thank you, Tom, and thank you, Dom, for the wonderful kickoff. Hello, everyone. This is Nadal here from InfoTrust Dubai, from a different side of the world. Happy to be here, excited to be here. I'm a CPG strategist team lead in the CPG industry team, working closely with Tom. And I will look forward to walk you through this session in just a while. So I'll pass it back to you, Tom.
Sounds good. We're here today to talk through some of the changes happening. You all live and breathe this every day. You know that there's never a dull moment. There's been a lot happening in the industry with the GA4 rollout and all that. All the privacy and regulation and impacts on that. We're going to talk through some of the approaches and how we can respond to that and make sure that we're setting you up for success in the future. So, as you know, everything's changing very rapidly. We can't just keep doing the things we've been doing. That's a recipe for failure. So as such, we have some ideas to talk through of how you can position yourself to really respond to those changes in the marketplace. Nadal is going to talk through some of these emerging CPG trends with you.
Yeah, and we thought that this would be a great starting point to look at some of the macro trends out there. These are trends that are shaping up the industry and what you're seeing more and more of, especially if you're associated with CPG and multi-brand organization. Some of the key trends that we are observing, more and more brands across the organizations that we work with are trying to have more focus towards direct to consumer as a touch point. In addition to having your product on a shelf space, this is also opening up a way to have a direct interaction point, also via e-commerce. And we are seeing that some of the brands that we work with in our CPG organizations are either moving towards a D2C by integrating e-commerce into the web and app platforms, In addition to that, there are also several acquisitions of D2C sort of brands into the existing sort of landscape. So this is one major change that we are observing. The other few changes include omni-channel experiences, and there is a constant push to create a seamless experience for the end consumer. Marketing or brands are excessively focusing these days on delivering a really great, seamless and omni-channel experience, making sure that the consumer interaction points are seamless. They match across different platforms like web, app, and any other touch points like customer loyalty platforms. We are also seeing a higher share of digital in the ad spends or marketing budget of organizations. If you look at the statistics from the US alone, in 2022, you can see that there is approximately 22.8% of share of digital in the overall marketing spend for CPG manufacturers. And that's a few percentage points higher than what we have seen in the previous years. And last but not the least, I think this is also going to be sort of the crux of a lot of conversations around Google Analytics 4 and similar other platforms and analytics solutions that also have AI powered to enable organizations to have robust cloud infrastructure, primarily for data collection, but also to have a more standardized measurement strategy with the end goal of understanding consumers better and making sure you're having better interactions with a defined objective that is very clear. So those are some of the key industry trends that we have observed. Next slide, please. That is also a segue into one of the other constant changes that we are observing in the industry. Data privacy is a keyword that is of very high importance. Tom already mentioned that we are going through a lot of landscape changes in digital marketing across advertising. And privacy is at the center of brand to consumer interactions in most of the touch points these days. So if you look at some of the stats that are out here, most of these are very interesting data points. You can see that there are many organizations that do not have good data management practices, which also means personal information of consumers can get into the wrong hands, and everyone may not be eligible to actually have access to that data. There have been several data breaches, and we come across more and more of those in the news. With that change and with that sort of scenario, consumers are finding it increasingly difficult to establish their trust in a brand. On the brand side, you need to think about how are you sharing your messaging with the consumers. Just having a consent banner on your website can go a long way in establishing trust and also maintaining transparency about how you are going to deal with the data that is being collected during the web interactions. Also, a lot of companies aren't very transparent about how the data is used. Consumers hence feel that their data is not adequately protected, which leads them to think twice before sharing their email address or some other personal information with a brand. Next slide, please. Back to you, Tom.
Thanks, Nidal. Yeah, building on that, obviously there's been a lot specifically changing in the industry around data privacy. So we wanted to talk through some of those items this morning as well. So we've all heard about the ongoing deprecation of third-party cookies, not news to anyone. Google Chrome did push back the official deadline for ending their support for third-party cookies to the end of 2024. But don't let that lull you into a false sense of complacency that we have time to wait around. Effectively, third-party cookies are already dead in many respects, given the lack of support in many other browsers, iOS, Safari, Firefox, Brave, and others. So hopefully your marketing approach is already resilient and robust, as focused on first-party data collection, as we can no longer rely on that third-party data collection. Additionally, you've probably heard, if you work in markets in Europe, about the different DPA rulings coming out. These are a few of them. There have been others, but France, Austria, Italy, I know Denmark had a ruling. These evaluate the legality of Google Analytics with regards to GDPR and collection of personal information from a user perspective. I'll leave it to Jaime and Lucas to cover some more ins and outs of how to actually respond to that, but obviously a lot is changing almost weekly on that front. Likely, everyone's heard of GA4 and the migration ongoing, and even though there was a deadline extension for those 360 GA4 properties, that they will be able to keep collecting data and be active into summer 2024, it's still a critical component that we need to be well on our way to migrating from UA to GA4 in that span. There are privacy implications around that as well. Obviously, GA4 has many privacy specific features that UA didn't have. How those will stand up to scrutiny in the courts as it remains to be seen in most cases, but it's something that we'll be actively monitoring. There are additional components too, Amanda, if you could go to the next slide, around Privacy Shield, the transatlantic freedom of transmission of user information between Europe, the EU, and the United States. Some of you may have heard that there was an agreement reached in principle earlier this year on an update to the Privacy Shield, which had been struck down previously by European courts. I know it is currently being evaluated. Again, I'll let the lawyers figure that out, but it's certainly something that we have to monitor closely, as that has a big impact in the ability of Google Analytics to operate and how we can use it within these organizations. CCPA gets all the attention, but it's worth noting that there are other state-level regulations being passed in the US as well. I believe we're approaching a half dozen states that have passed some form of data privacy regulation at the state level. So really, whatever tracking approach you build needs to be flexible and adaptable, because it won't stop at those 5 or 6. It will keep happening. There are more states with regulation being discussed right now. So we have to stop thinking at a granular level that we can be reactive to each of these changes, and need to implement a tracking approach that automatically is flexible and can respond preemptively to upcoming regulations. And then as well, the app tracking transparency and Android privacy sandbox plans for iOS and Android have had a big impact on third-party data collection within apps. And obviously, we've all heard of the impact that's had on organizations like Facebook. So in light of this, all these changes happening, let's be real. How have most organizations historically acted? The next slide. We've all been there. Track all the things. Historically, it was kind of like a collect first, ask questions later. It was, we want to collect as much as possible. We want to get all the information. We'll figure out what to do with it down the line. So it was, go in there and just absorb as much user information as possible. It's no longer the way we can do things. We've heard about those impacts from the data privacy organizations around data collection. I also want to flag some of the issues around that approach. So collecting as much data as possible without a clear justification of why it is necessary and relevant leads to inefficiency, risk, and reduced data quality. So for inefficiency, it's not just the fact that it costs money to implement, it also costs money to collect, hit counts in GA4 360, money to analyze for your data analysts to sift through in big volumes of data that may or may not be useful to your core purpose as an organization. It adds overhead and complexity to scaling new deployments. So there's a lot of costs baked into collecting more data, as well as risk. Beyond the obvious compliance risk of GDPR and collection of personal data, there also, not a week goes by that we don't hear of a data breach or a leak of user information. And if you're collecting a lot of that on your website, you're exposing user risk as well, or your users to that risk. And you don't want the blowback of eroding that user trust should there be some sort of leak of personal data that didn't really need to be collected or could have been better protected. Finally, the reduced data quality. Again, it may seem like collecting more data increases your quality, but as you go down the long tail and get away from first-party data, the data you're collecting is less and less relevant and actively useful to your organization, and it would decrease the overall quality of your data rather than focusing on what is the most beneficial, most actionable data you have. So as Ian Malcolm said, he said it best, we were all so preoccupied for many years on whether or not we could, didn't stop to think if we should, and we really need to flip that around and begin thinking about our tracking from a perspective first of what should we track, what is actionable and useful to the organization. So there's a guiding principle that ties all this together, and it is data minimization. This is something from the European Data Protection Supervisor. This quote is directly pulled from their site, but it's a great guiding principle to employ. And it reminds us that we need to only collect personal information to what is directly relevant and necessary to accomplish a specified purpose. We bolded it there or highlighted it because it is the most important component. It should be, if you don't have a reason for collecting the data or a specified purpose and it isn't relevant and necessary, why are we collecting it? It exposes you to risk, it's cost to implement, it's cost to maintain, it's cost to scale. And at that point, we really need to focus and flip the narrative and start thinking from the outset, what do we need to collect? What justifications do we have for collecting it? And how does that tie to our actual business KPIs? Nadal's going to talk through some of the benefits of data minimization here.
Thank you, Tom. Data minimization is a very relevant concept. And if there was one keyword that I think should ring at the end of this, throughout the messaging across the summit, I think that's the central theme that we have tried to put everything together, which is data minimization. It's very important to identify the purposes or business objectives and start from there, rather than have everything collected and then define what are your questions or which are the most important data points. So boiling it down to the metrics that really matter is what this is all about. And I'll go through a bit more about what are some of the benefits of this principle or methodology. Firstly, you need to focus your effort on just the most critical or the most valuable activities and not just looking at everything that you are able to measure. Secondly, and I think Tom explained this really well earlier about the different types of costs that are involved. So in a way, if you use data minimization principle, you can have a much lean implementation, which will also be faster to implement and easier, as well as, you can also read it as cheaper because the more amount of time that is being spent on implementing and further maintenance down the line is going to be directly proportional to the amount of money that you're investing into it in different ways. Could be hit counts, could be the actual consultant time spent, or a third-party agency you're working with to help deploy some of those implementations. Also, it's important from Tom highlighted a risk perspective to this, and the regulations and requirements are constantly changing, which means to be on the safer side and to be able to make changes in an agile, quick to respond technique, you would have to make it a very lean implementation so that you have the safety and also the flexibility to change, perform audits as required, and then make any corrective actions, especially when there are usually certain deadlines or timelines associated with when you have to make those changes. Also to add, the maintenance becomes much more streamlined. And even if you want to do net new deployments, you are not talking about 250 events in an Excel sheet anymore, and you're just boiling it down to what all can be standardized. Which are these, look at it from a point of view of, historically, we have collected, 250 to 300 different events across these websites. How many of these have we actually used? How many of these have actually added value to what we do day in, day out? Do they really matter, right? So that's where it comes to streamlining and also helping you to deploy these changes at scale, especially when it comes to CPG and multi-brand, and at a much quicker pace. Last thing to add, when you are in a CPG or multi-brand organization, you may have data that spans across different markets, regions, and it from a global standpoint, you may want to have a consistent data structure. And with consistency, data minimization can directly tie in, because the more moving parts that you want to keep tracking, you go further and further away from consistent data. And then that also affects your end use cases like audience activation, which our friends Akansha and Shasnika will also be covering in a future session. But these are, to boil it down, some of the key benefits of data minimization. Can we go to the next slide, please? So this is also a good segue to talk about the move that Tom mentioned earlier about universal analytics getting sunset. And most organizations that we are working with are already on the way to move and transition towards GA4. We are currently in a phase of planning trainings, enabling all respective stakeholders to be familiar with what GA4 brings and what are some of the changes. And with respect to data minimization, GA4 is really a blank slate. You can start from scratch. If you have ever wondered, you've not joined a new job and then you have to deal with all the mess that has already been there, that doesn't make your first week easier, right? So GA4 is really an opportunity to get a fresh, clean slate and start with deciding, do I want to move everything, all the complex and bad implementations over without thinking twice or without having a lens of, do I actually need to move everything over? Can we scrap or do away with the events or tags that really do not matter, right? So that's the opportunity that GA4 also brings, which means you get to a chance to redefine the architecture and also define a globally standardized measurement strategy for a large CPG or multi-brand organization. Next slide, please. So with that, we are currently, Tom and I and everyone else on the CPG team on the InfoTrust side, we are actively engaged in deploying some of the changes that are mentioned here and at scale. So what are some of the initiatives that we are actively involved in? We are working with different brands to perform privacy audits. There were certain DPA rulings that Tom called out earlier, which also put pressing requirement to have audits performed. And then, for example, IP anonymization needs to be enabled as a setting. And with universal analytics, there are certain configurations that you could do to change that. But with GA4, IP addresses for individual users are no longer collected or stored. So that's definitely a change. But then continuing to work with existing assets that are in universal analytics, you may have to configure that setting just to make sure you are compliant. Also data retention and some of these aspects we will be covered in a later session in more detail. Consent mode is another one of the changes that we are also piloting as well as deploying at scale. So there are certain markets, mostly markets from the Europe, where this applies more, to check how consent mode is having different values in data, doing comparisons, and checking whether it is actually giving more inputs in terms of modeled conversions, which is what the feature brings to the picture. We are also extensively invested in putting together trainings, internal certification processes to equip everyone with the changes that GA4 brings. And we are also trying to stay ahead of what are the new features that get rolled out. GA4 is not a fully ready product yet, and it keeps getting more and more features added at a fast pace. So we are trying to pilot some of the new features, test it in different scenarios for different business use case requirements, and then try to deploy, before deploying that at scale, also leveraging some of the automation capabilities that we have. So those are some of the active different engagements that we are in to deploy some of these changes at scale. With that, I will now pass this to Tom to wrap up this session and final thoughts.
Appreciate you sharing those thoughts. To bring this all together, data minimization is not an endpoint. It's a philosophy that should bring clarity and focus to your data collection. So think of it as a starting point that you can build upon with intentionality and specific justifications for layering on top of it. To that end, we're looking forward to the other sessions that will give you some details of how to approach that with GA4, first-party data collection, server-side tag management, which Tyler will lead, audience activation, and all the privacy considerations that Lucas and Jaime will cover. So we hope you enjoyed the session. We're really looking forward to the rest. Thanks so much for letting us speak to you this morning and joining us here today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tom and Nadal. That was wonderful and a great way to kick off the summit, talking about the concept of data minimization. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have different questions about this recent session. Unfortunately, we have to move on to the next time, or to the next session. So what I'm going to ask is, if you have those questions, please use the Q&A chat below. We'll be happy to do our best to answer those during today's summit. And if we don't have time, you can always feel free to grab a time with me and we can talk more about it. But on that note, let's go ahead and move over to number 2. And this is all about Google Analytics 4 and consent mode, filling the consent gap. And for this session, I can't think of no better people than 2 great colleagues, Lucas Long, the Director of Privacy Strategy with Tag Inspector, and we have Jaime Rodera, who is the Data Privacy and Consumer Data Manager at Nestle. Jaime and Lucas, thank you both so much for taking the time to really join us today and talk about GA4 with consent mode. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you guys.
Thank you, Dom, very much for the warm introduction. So as Dom mentioned, what we will be covering today is Google Analytics 4 plus consent mode, some of the problems with just tracking data and reporting on data and analyzing data with respect to consent, and then a potential solution to be able to solve this in the form of GA4 and consent mode. Now, while we'll talk a little bit about some of the regulations, or at least reference them, just remember this is not legal counsel. Neither Jaime nor I went to school long enough to be attorneys. So happy to provide, kind of advice, opinions, and some of the experience, but ultimately any of those decisions do need to be approved by your own legal counsel. So with that out of the way, just to set the scene a little bit here. So when we're talking about first-party data collection, we're talking about data collection on our owned and operated properties, so on your own websites, on your own applications. And historically, we've been able to have really full visibility into all of the interactions that are happening, all of the users that are coming to our websites, and that's represented here by this visual. Now it's broken out into 3 different buckets. That untracked, there's always going to be some users that maybe don't have JavaScript enabled in their browser, or something goes wrong with the tags and executing, or we don't have any data for. But by and large, we have a full picture of what's happening across our properties. We're able to assign some sort of identifier to all those users. So we can have session data, we can have user data, we can see behavior over time. Now, what's changed as we look at the next slide here, well, a number of things have changed, but the biggest change, especially in Europe, has been the introduction of the concept of consent and users having the right to say, yes, I'm cool with this particular data activity, or no, I'm not. And those consent requirements are different across the entire world. In Europe, we have both GDPR as well as e-privacy, and essentially we need explicit consent in order to be able to set cookies, access cookies. And then we also need a lawful basis for processing of personal data, which is oftentimes consent used for that for marketing and advertising purposes. Meanwhile, in the rest of the world, in the United States in particular, we have different laws. By the end of 2023, there'll be 5 states with laws that will be enforceable. And there, it's more of an opt-out mechanism. So users have the right to opt out of certain activities being done with their data, specifically for targeted advertising and cross-context behavioral advertising. So, Jaime, I'll kind of open up a question to you. With these different requirements across the globe, I guess, how are some of the ways that you're approaching it from that global perspective at such large scale here with these different consent requirements?
Thank you, Lucas. Thanks a lot for having me. as Tom was mentioning at the beginning, because of all these changes that are happening out there, we try to bring simplicity to all this complex landscape. So we tend to apply the Nestle privacy standards across the board. So when we are seeing that we have different legislations, different interpretations of the law, to your point, I'm not a lawyer, but I work with them quite closely, and we tend to build our own law. I wouldn't call it a law, but just to make it simple, is our own vision on how should we actually approach this so we can standardize regardless of the legislation. In order to add another layer of complexity, we want to bring simplicity by creating our own standards. So I would say standards is probably the key word for us here in Nestle in the global team.
Perfect. So standardization in terms of what that architecture looks like in order to be able to support and adhere to these different consent requirements. On this next slide, we have a little GIF that shows kind of the execution of one component of those standards, right? So the fact that when a user comes to a website, and this is how most websites manage data collection and consent today. User comes to the website, they're presented with a consent experience. At that time, we're not loading the tags responsible for data collection for analytics or setting or accessing of cookies. It's only after a user has accepted that consent do our tags fire. So Google Analytics only loads after a user has accepted consent. Facebook Pixels only load after a user has granted consent. Now, while this is the safe compliance approach, what it results in, if we look at the next slide, is it results in us going from this kind of classic historic scenario where we have full visibility, and then we move into, as we can see on this next slide here, a situation where we have a lot of gaps in visibility. So because our tags are not executing for those users that have not granted consent, what happens is we don't collect any data. So in order to adhere to those e-privacy requirements of not setting any cookies, we block the mechanism that is used to set cookies from happening, with a byproduct being no data is collected. What on the next slide, we can see what a lot of people on this call have probably experienced on their European websites. Once they've implemented a consent management platform and explicit consent requirements, this is a screenshot from GA just showing on that date in which those changes went into effect, that significant drop in user counts or some of those observed metrics. Jaime, I guess, what has been your experience kind of sitting in that privacy role with different brands and markets coming to you, I'm sure, concerned about this phenomenon?
Yes, this is actually, it looks very simple, but in an organization such as Nestle, it was such a complex topic to discuss and to solve. Because first, the message that you received from the market in the EU is, I'm losing traffic. I don't see people. And that's exactly the problem, the observability. We've worked with you guys, with Google quite closely on this one. And first, you have to educate people that the users are not leaving the website. The users are still there. You cannot see them due to people declining the cookie consent banner. So I'm more than happy to actually provide to the user the option to decline and respect people's choice. But then because we were into the habit of, to Tom's point, to track everything that we have done in the website, now many European markets came to us saying like, well, we are losing traffic. What do we do? So that was the biggest challenge I had, to first educate not just marketing communities, which are quite familiar with what's happening on the sites, also legal people and IT people. So I'm almost in the middle and trying to close that knowledge gap between the marketing team, legal teams, and IT people. So that was, I guess, the biggest challenge was like, Jaime, we are losing traffic. What do we do? It's like, well, first, we are not losing traffic. We cannot see the traffic. The traffic is still there. We don't see it. So that was, I guess, the first thing that came to me at first.
Yeah, and I think that's a very critical point that, like you said, it takes some time for a lot of marketing folks to really internalize. that nothing is wrong here. It's simply that we're not collecting data in order to be compliant, but it's possible that you have more conversions now, that you have more traffic than you had before. And that's really the crux of one of the big issues here, is that when we lack a observability, one, we don't know in this classic scenario what proportion of traffic is it that has gone dark, if you will. And so it makes it very difficult for us to be able to come to any conclusions with any level of certainty, even just trying to make directional types of observations. And so that's where some of these new solutions that are being introduced really come in. And with Google Analytics specifically in GA4, the solution that's being kind of put forth is consent mode. So what consent mode is, just kind of a high level summary, is that it's a technical mechanism that modifies the behavior of Google tags. Google tags today, there is support where other tags could also add support for consent mode signals. And basically what it does is it allows tags to become, how Google terms it, is consent aware, meaning that the tag itself, so Google Analytics, is able to be aware of the consent indication by the user, if they have consented, if they have not consented, if they've only consented to analytics use cases and have not consented to advertising use cases. And when the tag is able to have that awareness, it can then modify its technical behavior in such a way that it only collects information or only behaves in such a way that is aligned with the user's consent preference indication. So it's kind of on the technical side. On the practical side, what it allows you to do is load these Google tags for all the users. So instead of not loading the tag at all, you're still able to load the tag, and it's able to collect a minimum level of just pure interaction data. So not set any cookies, not set any identifiers, not collect any kind of user identifier information, but simply collect information about what page was viewed, or the fact that a video was started, what that video was, or a product was viewed, or a product was added to a cart, or a transaction has happened and what products were included in that transaction. So you're able to get pure anonymous interaction information. So we can still see raw event counts, we can still understand conversions, and it also provides a foundation for modeling. So we now can have a better understanding of what proportion of that traffic or of that picture on our websites has gone dark, and we can start to fill that in. So that's the real value within GA4 specifically, is that modeling, the conversion modeling, and then the behavioral modeling. So what this looks like kind of in practice on this next slide is just a simple graphic. In the classic scenario, like we looked at with that GIF, when a user comes to the website, if they do not consent, the GA is not loading at all. In this case, if a user does consent, GA operates as normal, but if a user does not consent, it operates in this consent mode, consent aware fashion. And what happens there is that those anonymous hits are sent, base level information is collected for purposes of that behavioral modeling, and we're able to get a full picture of what is happening on our owned and operated properties. So going back to our kind of conceptual visuals here, on the next slide, we have that current situation right now. So we have consent implemented, consent management platform. We're only loading Google Analytics when users do consent. We have this lack of observability. We have this darkness. We don't understand all of the interactions that are happening on our sites. We implement something like consent mode, and that brings us to, as we can see on this next slide, this situation where those gaps are filled in. It's not the same as it was before, because we still don't have user information for all of those different users. And a lot of our conversions and our traffic figures are modeled, but we do have a full picture and at least have reliable information. So we implement consent mode. We now collect these purely anonymous interaction pings. And we're able to fill those gaps with that anonymous data via that modeling. So with Jaime and with Nestle, what we've done is implemented a consent mode or a consent mode test. And we can see on this next slide some of the results from that test. And Jaime, I'll kind of let you walk through, what this pilot was, what some of the results that we were able to observe, and then how you're kind of communicating that and working with the markets for how they can leverage this or benefit from it.
Yeah, as you were mentioning before, first was the educational phase, letting people know what was happening, and then bringing a solution. So they were saying, okay, now we understand the problem. What do? We work with InfoTrust very closely and with Google on the implementation. We selected different markets, EU markets, to pilot this specific feature, Google Consent Mode, behavioral modeling. We explain very clearly in a simple presentation on what was the challenge, what was the potential solution, and the expected outcome. So before deploying the solution across many websites in the EU, we obviously had to test if this specific feature worked or not. So after the pilot, we have seen an increase in observable users of 23%, what you guys are seeing on the slide. So overall, it was a big piece of work because it was not just turning on and off something. It was more the educational portion, the setup of the project, working with you guys very closely with InfoTrust and Google, monitoring that everything was going on or working on track, and then explaining to the markets that have helped us to pilot this, what was the result and what does it mean for Nestle overall. I think one challenge that we had at the beginning as well was due to the situation in Italy, Austria, and other markets, we actually wanted to incorporate more markets within the overall scope of the pilot, but this was a very sensitive topic. So I think it's very important to call out that not every single market would like to actually incorporate their own data or share their pilots with us. So we were very, very carefully identifying the pilots, the websites, working with InfoTrust very closely on this one, and hopefully, luckily launching a successful pilot. So yeah, that was the whole story of consent mode with you guys and Google and our markets.
Nice. So yeah, so as we can see here from those pilot results, there was that uplift in at least observability. So we're able to fill those gaps in, like we talked about, for that proportion of users where we lacked that observability before. So to kind of pull a lot of these different pieces together, just for what an ideal state is for CPG. And I think one of the things that Jaime mentioned in that last little bit is extremely important, in that there is not a complete one-size-fits-all type of solution here. Some markets are going to have different consent requirements, as we talked about at the start. Some markets are going to have a lower level of, say, risk appetite for trying new things or implementing various different solutions. So what's important here is defining standards. And that's kind of that first part for that ideal state for CPG. While you can't have a one-size-fits-all, you can have various different standards that you want to assign to various different regions or different characteristics of websites. And so typical ones that with InfoTrust, we're working with a number of organizations on. Usually it's consent modes for the EU and the UK, where the modeling is supported. Today, very important to note, the modeling that is the main benefit from the implementation of consent mode is only supported in the EU and the UK. So that's where it makes sense to implement that solution. It has been promising for some of those reporting results. For the US, you can have slightly different architectures where user just is able to opt out, global opt-ins, global opt-outs, define those standards, and then assign those architectural standards based upon the individual local requirements. Jaime, I guess from your perspective, if there's really one key here, you talked about a few different areas. What would be the number one takeaway that people need to keep in mind when they're thinking about consent, the consent architectures, and some of these new features like consent mode?
I never thought I would say this, but to me, the legal department plays a huge role here. I've never really had such a strong relationship in my previous roles with the legal department. Actually, I didn't really like to talk to them because they didn't really understand me. So the fact that I'm closing that knowledge gap, it has helped us to actually be able to pilot and then share the results and now deploy that globally or in the EU. So I think I guess the main takeaway is working with your legal teams or with my legal team here has helped me to actually have another perspective on how they look things and be able for me to go back to the markets and articulate this in another way. So I think it's the corporate, the relationship that I have built with the legal team here at Nestle globally has been very, very important for me to actually deploy this test with you guys.
Wonderful.
Not sure if it's the best takeaway, but it's definitely a very strong relationship that I have created. Thank you to this.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. And I think that is the foundation, just like these standards are the foundation. And like we were talking about for foundational architectures, in order to be able to execute on features like consent mode. So
correct.
Wonderful. Thank you very, very much. And yeah, we'll kick it back over to Dom to keep us moving along.
Right on.
Thank you very much for having me, guys. Thanks a lot.
Absolutely. Jaime, thanks so much for joining us. And Lucas, always a pleasure seeing you. All right. Well, on that note, everybody, we're going to go ahead and take a 5-minute break. This is the only break that we have for today's summit. So during this time, feel free to grab a coffee, tea, water, whatever you got to do to get energized for our next section, which is all about server side. And you're probably wondering, what is that? We're going to answer that in the next session coming up in a few minutes. So try to get back here around 11:49, 11:50, and we'll go from there. We'll see you soon. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Hope you got your coffee and you got your tea and your beverage and your snack of choice ready for this next segment. I am super excited because we are going to be talking a little bit about server-side tag management and specifically the applied use cases. And I cannot think of anyone better to speak about this subject than a good colleague and friend of mine, Mr. Tyler Blatt, who's our lead analytics engineer here at InfoTrust. I'm super excited. I can't wait for this to kick off. So Tyler, take it away, my friend.
Thank you so much, Dom. Thanks for the intro. One thing I like to say here at the top of these every time is I'm happy to be the sideshow act that answers all server-side questions live on the air. So if you have any questions or something is confusing, this happens all the time. So by all means, jump in and ask questions at any time. All right, so what we're going to talk about today is I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction, but we'll do some applied use cases at server-side because there's a new technology and a lot of people are wondering, how am I going to use this technology? So that's kind of the goal of what this segment's going to be today. And here's our agenda. So first of all, I need everybody to know what is server-side tag management because it's kind of a nebulous thing. It's fairly new and people are still have shaky ideas about what exactly that means. Very closely linked to that is, why is the market changing? So what are the advantages? Why would I want to move to server side? And why would I ever undergo this as a company? Thirdly, I want to talk about how I talk about server side and what the talking points are. This is because quite often I'm seeing people need to evangelize within their own company why we need to do this. What's this poising them for? What is this going to allow us to do as a business? So this is just equipping you with some terminology and some talking points that you can talk to your colleagues about when talking about this internally. And then finally, we'll wrap up with 2 use cases that are real boots on the ground use cases that are happening today. I think, obviously following the previous segment, we're aware that there is some compliance issues going around GA in the EU right now, as well as how do we just do governance at scale? Following privacy, this is just a great thing to look into. How do we actually do this within server side? So we'll do some boots on the ground use cases. So let's jump into it. What is server-side tag management? Well, to understand server-side tag management, first, we need to understand what is client-side tag management. So talking through this slide a little bit, it may be a little bit confusing the order. What happens on the client side is our Google Tag Manager code is all loading on an end user's computer. So what first happens is client-side Google Tag Manager will be downloaded onto an end user's computer, and then it will establish the data layer. And then when that data layer starts getting interacted with, like a page view happens or events happen or something happens around a user, all of these tags below are going to fire. And what is important to note, and why this is called client side, or what the client is in this relationship, is this is all running on the end user's computer. This is why we're able to debug tags locally on our computer, because Google Analytics is firing from our computer, and so, along with Facebook, Twitter, and insert any other third-party tags that you may have. So the key takeaway here is this entire interaction, the loading of Google Tag Manager and all of these tags, is on the end customer's computer. So let's jump in and look at what server side does and how it changes that. Now, we still start on the left side of this screen. One important thing that I like to call out here is some tags will never be moved to server side, and client side tag management is still needed. So whether you're using Google Tag Manager or another tag management service, you're still going to need to fire some tags locally. So not everything will go to server side. So the first thing in our calls is still going to be the same. Our client side tag management system is going to be load, and it'll establish our data layer. Or if you're on the Analytics.js standard, it would interact with Analytics.js. From there, rather than loading tags directly on the site, we are just going to send a request from the end user's computer out to our server-side container. And the way to think of that server-side tag manager, or that server-side container, is it's just like any other web app, or really like those old third-party tags that we used to fire. We're just sending it to a centralized place. And what we'll do is we'll pass enough data into that data stream to be able to support fully firing Google Analytics, Facebook, Twitter, and other API calls in the cloud. And what that does is it lifts all that code off of the website and allows us a lot more control on what data we're going to send to those platforms and how exactly we're going to send it. We'll get into those benefits later. Obviously, we have Google BigQuery down here as well. One of the key benefits of server side is we can also store our raw data. So if you think of our data layer, we can just pick it up and store it wherever we want. So the key thing to think on this slide is no longer is all that code firing on the end customer's computer, but it's firing through a web app that we own somewhere in our cloud or maybe on-prem. So with that covered, let's talk about what are the pain points of client-side tag management that even got us thinking about this. One that's not on this slide and probably should be is big newsflash, third-party cookies are going away. So client-side tag management already is under a massive shift. Outside of even just this massive shift, there is also, if you think about, I have our two websites here, InfoTrust.com and TagInspector.com. All of those tags, like I said previously, are firing on those pages. And what does that do? More pixels or tags, whatever we're calling them these days, lead to a decreased site performance because we're eating up those valuable resources on the page. This is a big one when you're thinking about working with scale. How do I work through scale? The governance effort is done site by site. I get a lot deeper into this on a later slide, so I won't cover this one too much. It's just the idea that I have to figure out what tags are happening, what the compliance is, what are all of the possible things that I need to govern on a site-by-site basis, which can be very daunting and consume a lot of man hours. This is an interesting one. I hear this from marketers all the time. My data only exists in platforms. I have to go to Facebook for this data, and my top of funnel data is here, my measurement data is here, my CRM data is over here. All of the data that you've collected is flowing through your data layer. You have it all and have routed it to all these people, but there's no centralized place where you own it. So what does that lead to? Costly ETL pipelines trying to pull all this data back together, because for some reason, even though we compiled it all to send it everywhere, we didn't really set ourselves up to own the raw version of that at any point. So that's one of the big problems with in just the philosophy of what we're doing on client-side tag management. This is an interesting one. It depends on how fast your marketing team or your dashboarding teams or people that are reading these insights can react. But I have customers that do real-time intraday revenue projection, and the idea of a 4-hour processing time just isn't enough. The data is not real-time. So when we rely on these third parties to be our central point of collection, we're subject to their processing times and what we're allowed to do. So we can't really react at the speed that we want to react. This last one, especially following the privacy section, is an interesting piece. So what often happens is a user will consent to giving us their data, but something like Safari's ITP or ad blockers will block that. So when given consent and you're actually in your right to collect that data, sometimes technology is prohibiting it, and that causes our measurement scores. What I do not want someone ever to read this line is we can collect data regardless of someone's consent or technological preferences. We can go on to the next slide. So how does server side address all these things? This is meant to be generally one-to-one to what was going on client side. So overall, what's happening and what I wanted you to get out of those initial what is server side pieces is we've picked up most of the code off the site. Small caveat here, I will say some tags, including Google Analytics, need to fire one tag on site one time, and the rest of it can be moved to server side. So in all cases, we aren't picking everything up, but we are moving almost everything up to server side when possible. And what that does is it allows us to have less code on the site. Less code on the site means the site runs faster. The site runs faster means better SEO scores. So already, one of the quick wins is we're just going to see better SEO scores when we implement something like this, which a lot of people get excited about. That is my least favorite part about this, because I'm more interested in a long-term privacy-centric data collection infrastructure that allows people to react to the market. However, if you need to justify the investment in server side on the short term, it's a great thing, is that SEO benefit. Because we can store data in BigQuery, we break down those data silos. So I talked about we have all of our answers are in all of these platforms. Well, what if we could just pick up our data layer and store it raw, all that beautiful information we put in it? Now we have all of the information we need. So if something like Google Analytics is not compliant in France, all of a sudden we have all the raw data and we can actually make sense of it in a compliant way. So I'll get more to that when we get into use cases, but we can break down those silos of where all of our insights are everywhere and just own a version of it raw ourselves, so we have the ability to react. First-party data collection. So obviously third-party cookies are going away and a lot of measurement's going to have to change. The reason server-side makes sense is we can put any domain on this server. So this in this server-side tag management node in the middle of my slide here, I could put data.infotrust.com domain on that, and the communication between infotrust.com and data.infotrust.com will be on a first-party basis. So we're now collecting under the first-party veil, which is completely compliant and a future-proof way of collecting data, because it's not subject to problems with third-party data collection. So that's one of the ways that it just establishes that problem of third-party cookies going away. Centralized governance and improved data processing. Think about all the processing that has to go in. Do we have PII? Is it on the event standard? Is consent mode there? I have more on a slide on this later. What this allows us to do is, since that processing is not on the page, we're not eating up page performance by doing that processing, which means we can go nuts and we can really govern and put a lot of good, cool things in to make sure no PII ever gets collected down the pipeline and no event ever gets collected through that isn't supposed to be there. So we can do that in a single node that is enforced against all of our sites. So think of it as scale in CPG. Like I have 1,000 sites. How am I going to keep them all in event standard? Well, essentially we can enforce that in one place and make sure that in this one place that none of that is ever getting through, and the processing didn't hurt the page. So this is just ideal. The last one, access and enrich data in near real time. So essentially we can store the data in BigQuery without any kind of SLAs on processing, so we can see it, and we can also add data to the data stream. So if you have CLV scores that you want to pick up and add to this stream, we can do it because we have the time to go look it up and append it, and it's not eating on-site processing. Okay, I will go through the talking points really quickly. This is so, obviously there's a lot of text on this slide. I'm going to say this at a very high level. These are the key themes I talk about, which are ownership, control, and agility. Ownership being own as much of this data as you can and own the mechanisms of how it's being collected. That way you are able to react to things when things change. So this is about having as much on information as you can have that you own. My example would be if all of your audiences are stored in some other platform and then you need to pick up and move to a platform, isn't it better to own as many of those audience definitions on your side so that you can react? Control being control how and where you're processing data, so it's very easy to stay legally compliant and react to the changing market. So where am I sending data? How am I processing data? What country am I processing data in? What control can you get over that? And that kind of helps react to the market. And really a relationship between ownership and control is the agility you get. So it's being able to quickly react because you own what data you need and you control where it's being processed. So we saw states are rolling in with their own legal compliance. And if I'm thinking, how does my infrastructure support being able to react very quickly to state-by-state compliance? I need the ability to control how that data is being processed on a state-by-state basis. Server-side allows you to very easily implement complex logic that isn't weighing down your site to be able to react to that. So what this is the agility to react to to these upcoming privacy changes. We can go on to the use case now. I'm going to spend a little time on these use cases, and in about 6 minutes, I'm going to stop for questions. So if any of this has been cooking your noodle and you've got a question that you want to ask, please feel free to drop that in the chat. So this is a complicated looking slide. This is a map to how you can stay compliant with Google Analytics with the current legislation coming through in the EU with France, Italy, and then Denmark. What this is first, you would need a server-side GTM container or some server-side container. We'll use GTM for this example, that is EU-based, because this data is not allowed to leave the EU. And inside that container, we'd have to do a bunch of processing. So when it says GTM must alter remove, in order to stay compliant, you have to remove IP address, user identifiers, document.refer, URL parameters, any possible fingerprints. You cannot append any other identifiers, and you have to have deletion of any data that could ever be used to re-identify. And so this is quite prohibitive to how Google Analytics will operate as a platform. Once we have done all that, in our top arrow, we can send data to Google Analytics or some other analytics platform. This is when we're able to, we are now compliant with what's going on here. What's interesting about this is thinking about the ownership keyword here. If a user is given consent, the problem is between, we'll just use the French example. The French government doesn't like the fact that the American government has the ability to go in and look at this data. So the only real problem with collecting this data is that it's being stored and operating on US soil. Once we've gotten consent, there's no reason that we can't also store this data in Europe so that it's not breaking these, intercontinental laws. So we can change it and send it to Google Analytics that does not have a European option. We can also take all of those things that we stripped out and not strip them out and store them in a local EU database. So there's no reason we can't put a BigQuery in the EU so that we can quickly stand up a dashboard for our marketing teams to say, hey, we stripped out UTMs in Google Analytics, and I know that you were using that, but we stored that data in BigQuery and built a dashboard on top of it. So you still know where our users are coming from and what KPIs they're driving. So you can continue to keep the business rolling in that meantime. So already having server-side GTM, to go back to, we have the control of where data is being processed, what country and how, we are able to alter all of this data. We have the ownership of the actual container and the ownership of our raw data staying in the EU, and we have the agility to react to this market. So those are the three keywords when you're kind of talking to people internally on what you're getting, is that ownership, control, and agility. And I think this is embodied very well in this specific use case. So we got one more use case to jump into, and then we'll have a little time for questions. And then we'll be wrapping it up. So I just realized I made that line kind of crooked, so you guys can all laugh at my goofy slides. So what does governance problem look like? So I'm a CPG company, and I've got to govern all of my sites. On the left is what's actually happening. So we know we load data via Google Tag Manager in the data layer, and then it's passed to these platforms through the data layer. What are all the questions we have to ask in this process? What's going on actually on the page? Has PII made it into the data layer? Are we collecting data outside our event standard? Has proper consent been given for these tags? What tags are piggybacking that we don't know about? I'll get into why that's really, really dangerous with CCPA and GDPR. Is this same setup on all my brands? Do I have to do this on every single site? I have to do this manual labor or this very costly act? Are my containers set up to deal with compliance regionally? So we talked about states, we talked about the EU having different compliance, global, Brazil's getting their own ideas on compliance. So how can I enforce this regionally? Is my infrastructure set up for that? How do I know that I'm sending data to effectively carry out a GDPR and CCPA request? How can I delete someone's data in a platform if I don't know who they are in the platform? These are all problems with governing right now on client side and how it becomes very intense. You can go to next slide. In order to kind of explain how crazy this can get, this is an actual, I've cropped out who the customer is. This is an actual scan of all the tags and all the places that they're sending data. And it may look to them like they just fired an Amazon tag and they just fired Adobe Launch, which fired a few tags. But through piggybacking, which is a tag firing another tag, they're sending data everywhere and all over the place. So carrying out CCPA, or even saying what data layer information did each of these tags collect? because they're sitting on the client side, I don't know what specific information each of these might have read. So if I didn't send user information to them, then maybe I don't need to delete it. But how am I supposed to possibly understand the mapping of where all of these sites might have collected data? And this is how out of hand it can get. And then multiply this is just a single site, multiply this by 1,000 brand sites. And now you got yourself quite the governance problem. And so this is just an example of how quickly this can blow up. And this is a tag inspector scan. For those of you who don't know, this is our product that will measure exactly what's happening on your site. So we're going to move on. And this is my last slide before questions. So the big thing to call out here is we can do some of this on the client side, but like when data distribution is happening client side, we have to use that processing as a pressure resource because it's stealing from site speed and site operability. So if we start doing a ton of processing just to stay up in line with governance, then we're basically taking a page impact and an SEO impact for the reason of staying compliant, which no one is happy about. By doing this processing on the server side, we are now able to stay compliant and really control even what data these tags can see. And then from there, we can start routing them and do a lot of cool processing that is enrichment, but also privacy, and then get to the measurement we want, which is a lot easier to scale too, because it's just one container. So rather than having GTM be on InfoTrust.com and taginspector.com, we can put one single server-side container that all of our websites point to, and then they check our standard governance rules against them so that we're able to stay compliant. So one, it helps with the scale of things, but it also just gives us a significant amount more control. So I'm going to go through these benefits. Then I see Dom coming in to give me the light, and we'll see if we have any questions, and then I'll get out of your hair and you guys can move on to the rest of the great content. So one, thorough PII Can we go back real quick just to go over this? Sorry. Global event standard I talked about. Data is only collected if consent settings are present, so you'll never accidentally, you don't have to worry about that. We have one place where this comes in, so even a bad implementation, the data still won't be collected. No piggybacking because it's done outside of the client side, so we don't have to worry about other tags picking up data we didn't intend them to from the data layer. Containers handle regional changes for compliance, so we can handle that regionality very well. And also we can store all of our historical data, so when it comes time to say, where did we send data for this customer? What was our settings? We have all of that history stored in our own database, so it's really easy to execute on GDPR and CCPA requests and make sure that we're never falling out of compliance with that. All right, Dom, did we get any questions?
Tyler, first of all, I just want to thank you for including me in your slide. I saw the InfoTrust website. I'm very honored. The question I'm sure a lot of people have, Tyler, is like server side is great, but as we think about like the first step, what do they need to do? And what resources should they have internally in order to really begin this process?
So part of deploying server side is you're really setting up a web app. So InfoTrust is happy to help companies work on setting up that web app for you, or maybe your internal team wants to set it up. But what you will need is the resources internally to point your domain at that web app. And then from there, when we're talking specifically server-side GTM, all you really need on the client side in order to set up server-side GTM is a Google Analytics 4 implementation, because server-side GTM actually uses Google Analytics 4 as the event stream that flows into the platform. So from there, reach out to InfoTrust. We're happy to talk you through it. But if you have GA4 and you have a team that'll put a domain on, you're ready for server side, and reach out and talk to us.
Well, how about that? Tyler, can't thank you enough for giving this wonderful presentation, buddy. Again, thank you so much. We're going to go ahead and move on to the next section, which we're really excited about. And this is all about advanced analysis and activation strategies for CPG and multi-brand organizations. And I am thrilled to have two more colleagues come in from the InfoTrust side, two lovely ladies I could call friends. We have Akanksha and Shaznika, and they're going to walk us through this. So ladies, thank you so much for your time. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Tom. So hello, everyone. In this particular session, we'll be looking at advanced analysis and activation strategies for CPG and multi-brand organizations, considering all of the changes that are coming in our tracking as well as regulations, specifically in our industry. So before we get started, I think the most important part for any organization is to first assess where they land in their activation maturity model. So just presenting one of the models that we usually recommend to our clients, that is audience maturity progression. Basically, it's a crawl, walk, a run model that is kind of aligned with understanding where we stand in our activation progression. So usually when we are in the crawl stage, we are talking about how do we build audiences in GA4. We know that GA4 compared to Universal Analytics is much stronger. It has readily available templates, custom templates, predictive analytics templates built in for audience building. But what we are trying to do in here, we are trying to make sure that everything that we are gathering before we build this audiences is accurate. We need to make sure that our data that's coming in is accurate so that we can start doing a little bit of analysis to understand the customer journey and build some sort of benchmarks in the crawl stage. So what happens when we move from crawl to walk stage? This is where all the integrations take place. So when we say integrations, till now, we were working with our Google Analytics 4 data, but then we can integrate our online and offline data. If we are working on the ad tech slide, we can bring in our search ads, DV360 campaign manager data in. If we have our Salesforce data and then customer data, we can bring all those data in at this particular stage into the cloud, integrate it with our analytics data, and do some sort of behavioral analysis on our customer journey so that we can align our KPIs with those overarching business goals. What happens when we move from walk stage to run stage? So basically, I like this stage because this is where most of the interesting things happen. By now, we have integrated all our data into cloud. We are all set to do some advanced analysis, leveraging our first-party data and create some propensity modeling, customer lifetime modeling using the data science techniques. This is where we are trying to actually tweak our customer behavior. Until now, we were trying to align our customer behavior with our business goals. But now we are trying to tweak our customer behavior with things like real-time promotions or pop-ups so that we can align their behavior and come out of that decision fatigue so that their behavior is aligned to what we want to achieve as a business outcome. Next slide, please. So yeah, when we do this, it's very important for us to build the base in crawl stage. Basically, if we look into durable audience strategy architecture, it's broken down into 3 phases: collect and transform, analyze and predict, and then activate. But then when we are talking about crawl stage, we are basically in the collect and transform stage. This is where actually it aligns very well with our current summit theme of data minimization and tracking with purpose. When we are talking about tracking with purpose, we need to make sure that we are editing our data collection techniques and strategy very well so that we are getting the data that we actually need. And then we need to make sure that we have that confidence in the data that we are getting. Once that is done, that's when we are set to, do the analysis and get some value out of our data. In our audience world or activation world, what I would say, there's one common thing that everybody knows that nobody wants to talk about, which is garbage in and garbage out. So this is very important. If we do not have confidence in the data that we are collecting, if we are not sure if our data is accurate, then the insights that we'll get towards the end of it might not be implementable, might not give us anything out of our whole analysis. So it is important that this crawl stage is taken seriously so that we can build the base. Next slide, please. So how do we do this potential enhancement to our current architecture? Right now, we are looking at Google Analytics data. We are bringing it into cloud, doing some analysis, sending it back to Google Analytics for activation. But as we talked about briefly about it before, we can definitely integrate a lot of online and offline resources so that we can build that holistic customer journey. Of course, the tracking that we have, the data that we are getting in GA4 helps us in a lot of data enrichment. But at the end of the day, we need to make sure that we are getting the data from all our ad tech platforms, our customer, our CRM, and in fact, everything else that we can think of, even the offline resources. So once the data is out in here, we do certain analysis. And then once, even for activation, we do not really need to send all our data into GA4. We can send these information like the insights and the audience list out to those destination platforms, do advanced analysis, and build some durable activation strategies. Next slide, please. So when I talk about the overall architecture, this is somewhat what the overall architecture, once we reach the run phase, should look like. So basically in your collect and transform phase, you can see that you have all your Google Tech Stack platforms, as well as first and third party Stack platforms. These act as our source data. We are getting this data into the analyze and the predict phase, where irrespective of whichever cloud we are using, we are doing the analysis in the cloud. And then once the analysis has been done, we get that audience list out of it and the insights. We can pass on the audience list to the activation into the different platforms where we need them for activation, and connect it with the campaigns which will help us activate. If we get some other insights where the activation is not necessary, but we can definitely send that out to visualization platforms so that we can build a dashboard and share those insights with the broader team. Next slide, please. So this is the slide. I really like this slide. I want to spend some time in here. This is basically the use case library for CPG and multi-brands clients and multi-brand organizations. As you can see, it's built on See, Think, Do, Care model. So basically, it has an integration and intersection between our crawl, walk, run model, basically defining our maturity, our activation maturity, with multiple levels of marketing funnel, which is defined at the bottom here. You can see increasing awareness, consideration, growing offline sales, and driving growth. Whatever our goal be, we can see what strategy we can use depending upon where we stand in our activation maturity. So consider if we are in the crawl stage and we are wanted to do some sort of awareness campaign. What can be done? Like, what strategy can be applied? Of course, it has to be a little broader, where we are focusing more on geography and demography to focus and build that client base at the early stage. Now let's consider if our organization is at run stage, and again, we are still trying to build that awareness. At this point of time, we have already done our baseline effort, right? We have that baseline set of customers that we want to target. The idea is to now create those high value audiences. Of course, our high value has to be defined by organization's goals. So we need to create those high value audiences and then see how we can expand that set of audience so that this will lead further down into the marketing funnel and will get more conversions at the end. So as you can see, it aligns and it shows up a lot of strategies that we can apply on different phases. Please feel free to take a look at it when we share the slide. Next slide, please. Now let's look at specific use cases and that we can implement depending upon our audience maturity. So as this is segmentation analysis, and let's talk about where we can implement it. So if we are in run phase, we have already integrated our ad tech side data with our analytics data into cloud. We are all set to implement the segmentation analysis. What is segmentation analysis? It is the practice of dividing our target market or target customer segment into approachable groups so that we can develop the strategies and then derive the efficiency and profitability that we are looking for. What's the value that we get out of it? It's that activating on the durable audience strategy, basically utilizing our first party data and the GMP data as well. It's all about data integration. So it gives us that holistic customer journey and customer behavior insights that we are looking for. What is the strategy that we are trying to tap in here? So we are trying to help the organizations to activate on the campaigns based on customer acquisition behavior and conversion data. I have also listed down some of the requirements in here so that if you are looking to implement a segmentation strategy, it will be good to just understand that we fulfill all these requirements and we are all set to make sure that we can implement it with success. Next slide, please. So if you're looking at segmentation analysis, it's also important to understand how we define our focus metrics and then how we see that are we actually being successful in implementing that or not. I have defined here some potential use cases, but the one that I want to discuss today is the exclusion targeting. We do a lot of use cases, but this one is something that is not actually done by a lot of organization, but it has a lot of value. So usually what happens in exclusion targeting, we look at, if it's consider if your organization is you have a particular B2B product portfolio and you want to do a campaign for that portfolio, but you also have a certain other product portfolios that are more B2C and retail based. So once you are trying to do that campaign, if you can build a list of audiences for those retail segments and then blacklist those audiences from the current campaign activation strategy, what will happen is we'll save a lot of money and we'll save a lot of effort in terms of optimizing on those blacklist campaigns. And then what will ultimately result in, it will give us help us target, optimize our targeting metric as well, which is engagement rate. We'll definitely get better engagement rates because we are saving on those unnecessary clicks that we'll get if those retail customer click on our campaign. And what we have seen working on this strategy with many of our clients is a positive directional lift in ROAS and CTR. So happy to help out. And if you have any question, feel free to put on chat and then happy to answer those for segmentation analysis. Next slide, please. Now let's look at cohort analysis and specifically targeting high value customers. So what is cohort analysis? It is a type of behavioral analysis in which we analyze and break our existing client customer universe basically into smaller, more actionable cohorts so that we can target and focus them. What is the value that we get with cohort analysis? So basically the primary insight is into the high value customers and profitable customers. Like what is that durable strategy that is working out and how we can activate on this particular cohort. The secondary insights that we get on is regarding this cohort is, if there certain customer set that is spending more on our on website or our products, then why are they doing so? And what is different from the other set of customers? What are the predictor variables and that lead to this outcome? Basically, why are they spending and what particular predictor variable is helping them out? If we have visibility into these secondary insights, we can probably use these predictor variables for some other customer segment and see if we can utilize that for activation as well. The strategy that we are using here is to help our clients activate campaigns based on our customers' spending behavior. Basically, we are trying to activate and target the high value customers. As I previously alluded, that value is something that we can define specifically for each business, but it definitely helps either ways, whatever the definition be. We are targeting and making sure that the end goal is to make sure that we are targeting those customers and that leads to more conversion. One thing very important when we are working on cohort analysis is to make sure that we have a set defined objective, list of metrics that we want to target, and defined cohort identifiers. Usually when we do cohort analysis, we end up at like X number of cohorts. But then all those X number of cohorts might not be relevant and informative for us to work on. The point is to make sure that we define those cohort identifiers, list them and break them down to the number where we want to go ahead and then activate on. Once we have done that, we can perform the analysis and then verify our cohorts by activation. Next slide, please. Let's look at custom bidding. So what is custom bidding? Next slide, please. Yeah. So basically, custom bidding, it's based on the fact that not all goals or not all KPIs is of same value to the business, basically. What custom bidding helps us do is, it helps us use our first-party data to define how much each impression that goes out to the customer is worth. So in DV360, we can use this insight to build our algorithm to optimize our bids so that we can get better performance out of our campaigns. What is the value that we get out of this? Of course, people who have used DV360, they will know that we have automated bidding strategies, smart bidding strategies that helps us automate some level of automation to the bidding. But then it can only be done to a certain level. If we need furthermore optimization and automation in the KPIs, this is what we can achieve using custom bidding. It helps us optimize the KPI and specifically tailor it to the business requirements. As you can see, I have listed down multiple KPIs and then multiple metrics that can be used for custom bidding. I call it different strategies that we can use in terms of complexity, right from contextual data that we get from our analytics GA4 to predicted CLV, customer lifetime value data, which we can get from defining the models when we have all the data in the cloud. This gives me a good segue to pass it on to my friend Shasnika here. She will talk about data science with BigQuery.
Thanks, Akanksha. Hi, everyone. I'm Shasnika Dumel. I'm a data science specialist here at InfoTrust in Canada, and I'm here to talk about data science with BigQuery. So Akanksha had briefly touched on the use of BigQuery machine learning to help organizations understand customer behavior and build audience segments, and also specifically build and predict specific audience behavior. So I want to deep dive into that a little bit more. And to start off with, in the slide that you're seeing right now, what I really want to highlight here is that BigQuery machine learning, also known as BigQuery ML, helps you leverage the use of your first-party data. And that's all we've been talking about throughout this summit, is understanding how to leverage your first-party data. And this is one opportunity for you to do so. And it's an opportunity for you to create a more durable approach for the long term, because it also enables reproducibility of your machine learning models, and you can not just utilize your data scientists, but you can also allow your analysts, whether it's your marketing team as well, to really build and operationalize machine learning models in massive structured as well as semi-structured data sets. And this is great also because you can have different teams being able to understand how the data is built, as well as how the model is built as well. So going on to our next slide, what we want to highlight here is this is how simple the process can be to use BigQuery ML. What we can start off with is as simple as using a BigQuery native integration with your GA4 property. You can collect all your web and app data and store that within BigQuery as your data warehouse. And then your analyst can go in there and start querying the data, understanding which data points they want to include to create tables and data sets to build those variables that you will eventually push into your machine learning models. And then by utilizing your BigQuery machine learning, you can actually start understanding your customer behavior and go a step further by being able to predict your customers' likelihood, for example, to convert, or also be able to understand, what are the different customer personas that you can build with the data points that you have. Taking all that information, results that you get from BigQuery ML, you can then have your analysts send the results back to Google Analytics using measurement protocol or data import to be able to create those audiences, and then start working on understanding where you're going to push them within perhaps the Google marketing platform, or within the platforms that you have defined in your audience strategy, as per what Akanksha had touched on earlier. And moving on to the next slide, just want to highlight how easy it is to use BigQuery machine learning, in the sense that from building the data sets to be able to train the model and then deploy the model. The capabilities within BigQuery ML allows for the development of the models with the ease of using your standard SQL. And then you can carry out all the training, testing, and predicting of the model without the need of transferring your data from one place to another. So overall, it just creates efficiency because your team is able to look into the data within BigQuery, be able to query it, create tables, etc., all using one language, which is SQL, and then start building those models for you to be able to build audiences. And moving on to our next slide, what I want to highlight here is that, so far I've only talked about connecting with your GA4 property or your digital data sets. But what's really great is that because BigQuery has these integrations to other platforms, you can also bring your other first-party data into BigQuery. So you can connect your online and offline data sources, so you can build those data sets within BigQuery that would be relevant for your model. And this will give you a holistic picture of your customer journey as well. And then our next slide, what we want to highlight here is just how simple, when I talked about how simple it is to build models within BigQuery, this is an example of the lines of code that you need to use to just build it. And as I mentioned earlier, again, you just need to use SQL. So there's no complex R or Python languages that your team needs to know. And you don't need to write long scripts or migrate the data from one area to another. All in one place is what makes this so easy and efficient to use. And especially when we were talking about building a baseline model or machine learning model to build predictive insights and audiences, BigQuery ML definitely provides you with that advantage. Moving on to the next slide, what I want to highlight here is that you've already seen, most likely, the GA4 provides you with predictive audiences. So one example here is that it'll tell you which of your customers are likely to make a purchase in the next 7 days. So this is great. This builds an appetite for your teams in your organization to leverage the power of predictive analytics. And we can take it a step further by using BigQuery ML because we can customize it even more. So instead of looking at the next 7 days, we can look at the next few weeks or month or so. And we can look at specific purchases of specific products that your customers are likely to purchase. So all that customization can be done using BigQuery ML. And then going on to our next slide. This is just a use case of how you can build custom attribution with using the data within BigQuery and using your BigQuery ML. And on the next slide, just want to highlight some other use cases as well. So we can build in propensity models, customer lifetime models, time to reorder, and also an understanding of which of your customers are likely to churn. These are all valuable information that will be relevant, especially when you're looking at, providing personalization or integrating personalization marketing to your strategy. And moving on to the next slide. Revenue forecasting is also another use case where we can use BigQuery ML to be able to predict their revenue within the hour, within the day, etc. And then on our next slide, I just want to quickly wrap up our overview of advanced analysis and activation strategies. So in summary, by using the crawl, walk, run approach, you can leverage your first-party data to analyze and activate your customer data across, your channel campaigns and just for your marketing strategy overall. And then you can use BigQuery ML to create the opportunities to build customer segmentation to drive greater personalization and overall provide your brand the ability to nurture your relationships with customers along the customer journey. And that covers the session. We hope you enjoyed it. Dom, over to you.
Jasnika and Akansha, thank you both so much. That was a lovely and wonderful presentation, and we can't thank you enough for taking your time. Awesome. Well, we are going to go ahead and move on to our final session of the day. We had to talk about the elephant in the room, which is GA4, right? So now we're going to talk about deploying GA4 at scale, what's new for the CPG industry. And for that, I'm happy to invite one of our lead speakers, Nadal, back to talk about this section. Nadal, thank you so much, my friend. Take it away.
Thank you, Dom. Hello, everyone. And in case you missed my introduction earlier, just to quickly introduce myself, a strategist and team lead in the CPG industry team here at InfoTrust. And I'll be happy to walk you through the final concluding session of the CPG Summit, which is deploying Google Analytics 4 at scale for CPG and multi-brand organizations. So this section will be about what are some of the major changes that comes along with GA4, especially with data collection, and also looking at some of the featured, some of the good features to look out for in case you haven't already started implementing some of these. So firstly, I think we covered a lot of this in our previous presentations as well. A lot of landscape changes in digital analytics overall. Firstly, consumer preferences is more important than ever. It's important for brands to be more purposeful with what they would like to collect. And at the same time, being transparent with your end consumer is also super critical. Secondly, we have a lot of regulatory changes. There were a couple of questions in the Q&A as well about multiple regulations popping up left, right, and center, and how do you make sure you adhere to each of those regulations when you know that more of them are in the works and just waiting to get out there. So I think the way to look at it from a large CPG organization's perspective is coming back to our through line or the main theme around data minimization. How can you make your analytics implementations, especially with GA4, as lean as possible so that you have the ability to pivot and adjust if needed, because it's not going to be, at the start of the year, what you decided will not probably be where you are at the end of the year. So we need to constantly be aware of what's new, which new regulations are out there, and what actions need to be taken and what decisions need to be taken as an organization to minimize impact and to address all of these changes. Lastly, there is also changes in the technology landscape. So browsers, third-party cookies are being deprecated. There are going to be more and more restrictions in terms of being able to use third-party cookies for advertising and also for audience activation. Used to be much easier, but that is going to go away, which means how do you do a more first-party driven strategy, right? We had an amazing session with Tyler earlier about server-side and how you can use that to have more control over what you deploy and have more control over the data that gets collected without having to rely on thousands of client-based implementations. We all looked at the cookie reports and the third-party tag piggybacking scenarios in those sessions. So these are some of the key changes that's driving the industry. Next slide, please. Google is also addressing some of these changes and need to have a more robust product out there, which is in the in a way of how Google Analytics 4 is also getting evolved. So some of the key areas where the innovation is happening is in these three. One, with the data collection model. Google Analytics 4 is primarily first-party oriented, and it is much more flexible. It uses a user plus event-based data model, which we will cover a bit more in detail. Secondly, the ability to derive powerful insights. For organizations, you are able to customize what sort of insights you would like to see. You're able to have your own thresholds or benchmarks set up so that you could either rely on automated insights using Google's built-in ML, or you could have your own custom insights depending on some of the variable needs that your organization has. Last mile is about data activation, which Akansha and Shasnika covered in just the previous session. How can you take action on your data? And Google Analytics 4 with integration possibilities using BigQuery and other integrations, you're able to activate your first-party data in a more seamless fashion. Let's go to the next slide. So here is a more detailed look at the user plus event data model that Google Analytics 4 uses. In Universal Analytics, fundamentally, there were multiple types of hits, but fundamentally, you used to have a separate type of server call or a hit for page views as compared to events. But now with GA4, every interaction is an event, including sessions and page views. So there is a fundamental difference in the definition of some of the metrics as they get carried over from Universal Analytics to GA4. So it is also fair to expect that you will see some differences in the actual numbers when you start comparing some of the metrics, because the definition and the data collection itself is fundamentally different. Understanding this user plus event data model a bit more. So every user who goes on to a website or an app or a digital asset in general will have certain parameters associated with that user, which will not change frequently. But then those parameters are also associated with the interactions that the same user makes on the website. And these interactions are what you call as events. There are different types of events with GA4. One great advantage to having GA4 is with the enablement of data stream setup or GA4 measurement setup, you get a set of automatically collected events. Some of them are first visit or user engagement, etc. You also have, with the toggle of a button, also some enhanced measurement events such as outbound clicks, scroll or search results, etc. So these are some events that you get right out of the box by just clicking, enabling a checkbox. These events also have some automatic parameters which do not need to be defined. So these are some out-of-the-box parameters. In addition to that, you could also have custom events from a CPG perspective, locating a store or a click to buy. These could be some of the key interactions from a conversion standpoint if you do not have e-commerce on the website, which most CPG websites do not have. But we also talked about one of the industry trend, which is having more and more D2C websites or interactions for some of the CPG brands. And that's where you also may need to rely on e-commerce events. So Google has a list of recommended e-commerce events. You could tweak that, customize a bit according to your use cases. And with that, you could also have those additional parameters associated with the e-commerce events. So to sum this up, you have the user tied with the events, and it's not following a traditional more rigid structure that you used to have in Universal Analytics, where you had to limit everything into either a category, action, label, values, plus some custom dimensions and metrics. Rather than that, you now have the ability to define a lot of custom parameters, which could be reused across multiple events. So hopefully that summarizes how the new data model works in GA4. Let's go on to the next slide, please. So let's now talk about some of the feature highlights. What are some of the net new changes and some key additions that will give you a whole new perspective of how you can do analysis and insights generation from Google Analytics 4. The first feature I'd like to highlight is the availability of white space reporting. Earlier with Universal Analytics, you had custom reporting, but it had a lot of limitations. It wasn't technically white space reporting like a drag and drop interface. It was more of a rigid UI, and you had to select out of the limited available options, and there were certain limitations in terms of like how many metrics or dimensions you could put together in a report. Now with GA4 Explore, which is the white space reporting section, you now have a drag and drop interface to visualize your data, which means you are able to choose the metric and dimension of your choice so that you can put it together in a report and then see specifically, you could even drill down create segments from some of those the values that you see in the tables. And you also have certain templates that are available, such as custom funnels or lifetime value analysis, etc. So these are some of the changes with the new white space or explore reporting. You can also add predictive metrics to your reports, as well as create segments, audiences, etc. One thing I would like to also call out is if you are not seeing a specific metric or a specific event parameter within your explore reporting, you may need to define that parameter as a custom dimension in the GA4 user interface itself in order for you to be able to see that in your reporting. So that's just a call out, just one additional step that you need to take to make sure the dimensions or metrics that you need are available at your disposal. Next slide, please. Another feature to look at from a reporting standpoint is more customizable reporting. And this is more referring to the standard reports and not the custom reports. The existing standard reports can be customized. If an organization would like to have certain reports being shown as like the default reports, and if you would like to edit or customize how the menu looks like on the left tab, you could do that. You could choose your own collection of reports that would make most sense for your business users. You could also edit the way how standard reports look like to adjust the widgets, change the choice of metrics that you have in the report, etc. All of that is now possible, and this also, going away with the traditional rigid reporting structure is another key change to highlight here. Let's go to the next slide, please. Another feature highlight and something to be mindful of when you deploy GA4, by default, the attribution model that is used is the data-driven attribution model. And this is a proprietary machine learning algorithm that Google uses to determine the value of subsequent touch points within a user journey. So I do have a simple example here. These days, to be very honest, this is just an example. The actual use case could be, a consumer could go through 15 or 20 touch points before actually making a purchase, because the digital journeys are much more complex now. But for the purpose of explanation, if we look at a simple example here, if somebody were to go through a search medium and then had email communication with a brand, and then they went ahead clicking the CTA button on the email to complete a purchase, GA4 would also look at, by way of data-driven attribution, to see if introducing an additional channel or an additional touch point would increase the likelihood of purchase. That's what the data-driven attribution does. It looks at combinations that work. It looks at the order in which the interactions occur. It even looks at factors such as the type of creative assets that were used in the marketing communication, or the order in which certain ads got exposed. So all of these are input variables that goes into the algorithm for Google to define whether having some of these channels at a certain level of the user journey would have, would increase more likelihood to purchase. Let's go to the next slide. So coming to the next feature here, search insights, again, an add-on to the ML or AI capabilities that Google is deploying into Google Analytics 4. You're able to do a lot of natural language querying into the search bar to find the reports that are relevant, or help articles that are, that address your question. It could also give you suggestions about a certain section of the admin settings where you need to make a certain change. So these are some of the ways in which you could leverage search in a different way to look at different outcomes. Next slide, please. Analytics intelligence. So we talked about this already. Insight generation is much more easier. You get a set of automated insights, but you could also set up your own custom insights. A couple of features to highlight would be anomaly detection and contribution analysis. If there is a certain anomaly within your data, which is an abnormal spike or a certain drop in a certain metric, you could have Google look into why that anomaly occurred, and what are a set of factors that are contributing to that anomaly, which is what is known as the contribution analysis. So these leverage statistical techniques to help address some of your questions about why a certain anomaly occurred and what could be the possible way to fix that anomaly. Next slide, please. Google also leverages built-in machine learning, and I think we covered this a lot in the previous session, so I will not go through a lot of detail, but you do have the ability to leverage predictive audiences. For example, what is the percentage or which segment of users could churn in the coming 7 days. Or you could also bring in predictive metrics into your reports, which could be the churn rate or purchase probability and metrics like that. Lastly, just to provide a snapshot of some of the privacy features in GA4, which also ties in with the landscape changes. These are some of the changes that you are able to, data controls that Google Analytics 4 gives you in order to tweak how certain settings are across different regions or geographies. So coming back to the point about data minimalization or the need to collect only the metrics that matter. There was also an additional statement about you collect the metrics that matter and you keep that data in your databases or in your data repositories only for a certain period of time. If you do not need it beyond that, then you do not need to keep it, right? So that's the concept of data retention. You have the ability to control data retention. The minimum is 2 months and the maximum is 50 months. It's not recommended to go with a maximum data retention setting unless you have like a valid use case for it. Google signals and location as well as device data can also be granularized using controls for region-specific settings. So if there are maybe regions like Europe where there are a lot of regulations heavy, you could decide to have a different measurement approach and maybe disable Google signals or cross-device data in some of those regions. So that granular controls are available. We already talked about consent mode and how you can leverage behavioral modeling to get conversion data for non-consented users. And a couple of last points to add here about local data processing, especially European Union. The data collected from European Union was earlier processed in the US, but that has led to a lot of feedback. And then now European Union data is processed locally within the Europe itself. Lastly, GA4 does not collect individual IP addresses. So IP anonymization is a feature by default, which you do not need to enable specifically. Next slide, please. This is just a recap of what we covered during the keynote session about deploying some of these changes at scale. So we are actively involved in working with the CPG and multi-brand organizations to deploy pilot runs for the new features, trainings and certifications, consent mode, as well as doing full-fledged privacy audits, especially in light of regulatory changes. Usually we get requests from those markets that are directly in purview of those regulatory changes. And there's usually a deadline or a timeline associated with those auditing requirements, which means we have to turn around these pretty quick. And like Tyler mentioned in his earlier session, you're talking about like thousands of websites here, and that needs to be turned around at scale. So those are some of the initiatives that we are actively engaged in. With that, we will wrap up this session on GA4. A few closing thoughts to note. It would be recommended to move towards a privacy-centric measurement strategy. You would want to also make sure you have sufficient governance in place. For example, third-party tag piggybacking is a good example of how there can be misuse of personal data and how one tag can lead to another tag sending data to a million endpoints, which you're not able to track and you're not able to control after a certain level of proliferation. Lastly, server-side tagging and how it gives you more control over first-party data architecture, as well as how you can have more accurate implementations. as well as enrich your data with additional data points, which gives you more control over what you can associate with data that's being already collected on the website. Next slide, please. And that's it for today. So if you haven't already started the GA4 migration, it would be a great time to kick that off. InfoTrust can help you with that. You can also check out some of the resources on our website. And if you want to get prepared for a GA4 migration, if you haven't done that yet, you could also contact Dom. And with that, I'll pass this to you, Dom.
Nidal, thank you so much. What a wonderful presentation about GA4, and really appreciate the shout out there. Now, you may have noticed, but from the 5 sessions, there seemed to be a similar theme, and that's the following. At the end of the day, your objective as a business is to really have intent and purpose when it comes to your tracking and beginning to instill that data minimization in your digital practice. This is a really exciting time to be in the space right now. So be optimistic, be open to testing and learning, and take action now. And on that note, before we get going, I want to thank all the speakers for taking the time to come in and join us today. Thank you all for joining us as well. We'd love to hear from you. So if you wouldn't mind, please scan this QR code right here. We'd love to continue to improve our summits, and we would appreciate any feedback that you have about the most recent summit. You know, areas that you enjoyed, areas where we can improve, what you want to hear next time, all of that stuff. And again, thank you all so much for your time. It's been a great pleasure speaking with you all. We hope to hear from you soon, and have a great rest of your day or a great night.